we have to go back to this idea that I mentioned or alluded to earlier. The glucose molecule in table sugar is the exact same structure and form as the glucose molecule that came from some fruit, vegetable, or other whole food source. It's not like the glucose molecule from the sugar is labeled as poison. It's not like your body has this glucose segregating police force that says, you, glucose molecule that came from the sugar, you are banished to the fat cell. But you, glucose molecule that came from the whole grain food, you can go into the muscle cell. And you, the glucose molecule that came from the kale, you can go into the nerve cell. No! Your body doesn't care or know the difference between where the glucose came from. Glucose is glucose. Now, even though I said glucose is glucose and that our body doesn't differentiate between the sources from where the glucose comes from, there are still some important considerations we have to have when it comes to sugar. For example, sugar is often referred to as empty calories, meaning that glucose and fructose is essentially all we get in the form of calories and energy from that sugar, as opposed to getting that glucose and fructose from whole food sources. In that case, that glucose and fructose is often going to be associated with other benefits, with things like vitamins, fiber, and other nutrients that can help bolster health and wellness. And building further off of this idea of empty calories, if we had to pick the most negative thing when it comes to sugar, it's probably this. We can eat a ton of it without actually feeling that full. And when you think about it from the perspective of, say, like early human ancestors or hunter-gatherers, did they get carbohydrates and some simple sugars through ingesting fruits and vegetables? Yes, of course. But were they also creating these factories where they were developing refined table sugar to also add to the foods they were already eating? No. But we do. Think about maybe the last time you went to a restaurant. Maybe instead of ordering a water, you ordered a soda. And maybe you got 2 to 3 refills. And that extra sugar that was in that soda was ingested and probably didn't make you feel any more full than if you just had 2 to 3 glasses of water instead. Also, adding that sugar to foods that we already eat, again, probably doesn't increase how full we feel, but increases the amount of carbohydrates and sugars and therefore calories that we ingest on a day-to-day basis, again, depending on how much sugar that you ingest. And so this whole idea, again, is we've changed the ratio and therefore the total amount of carbohydrates and sugars that we ingest. The sugar in and of itself is not evil. It's the amount that we're getting so easily included in our daily diet. So another thing that I think will be helpful is for us to understand what happens as the glucose circulates throughout the body and what happens if there's too much. Now, we already know that the glucose will first go to the liver, and any fructose that's in there will just get converted to glucose anyway. But the liver will also start to store the glucose in its storage form, which is called glycogen. And the liver can store about 100 grams of glycogen. And the rest of the glucose that isn't stored in the liver will circulate throughout the body. And yes, insulin is going to be released by the pancreas in response to these increasing blood sugar levels. And we're going to do a whole video series on insulin and diabetes. So for now, just know that insulin essentially tells the majority of the cells in your body to take the glucose from the bloodstream and into themselves, therefore lowering blood glucose or blood sugar levels. And if we take a look at skeletal muscle in particular, that glucose that gets pulled into the skeletal muscle tissue will also get stored as glycogen. And the skeletal muscles throughout your body could store about 400 to 500 grams of glycogen depending on who you are. So kind of think of the liver and the skeletal muscle tissue as little gas tanks for glucose and glycogen. But what happens when we've completely filled up the liver, completely filled up the skeletal muscle tissue, and there's still more glucose in the bloodstream? That's when we start seeing the glucose getting converted to fat and getting stored in the adipose tissue. And that's where we can start to run into problems by really increasing our glucose or our sugar intake beyond the capacity of, say, like our liver and our skeletal muscle tissue. So hopefully that gives you a different perspective or a better understanding of how sugar can be bad. So consistently ingesting too much of it and having increased blood glucose levels, and that excess blood glucose getting stored as fat and increasing weight over time. And the associations of increased adipose with things like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and other conditions. But finally,
There you go.
how does exercise...
How does exercise? It does.
Why would